A lot of what's being talked about these days is rewiring the brain. That's great, but what I see as a missing piece of that puzzle, it is the tendency to go into that downstream piece instead of what triggers me in the first place. And so the first part on that adaptive memory processing, where you're digesting your emotions, your feelings, your memories, your experiences in a healthy way, is first to ask yourself if you're willing. There's a willingness factor that has to be present. Like, I really want to shift this. I realize that some of the belief systems and the behavior patterns that have emerged from these early experiences, which may not fit the definition of trauma.
Welcome to the Woman's Doctor podcast, helping empower women to embrace their body and soul's full potential. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Cates, and after 22 years of working with patients, I found the answers to our health struggles are much deeper than most people realize. To help explore this, I'm interviewing colleagues and other wellness experts to get to the root cause so women can realize their true beauty and be informed decision makers for themselves and their loved ones. Trauma is something we have all experienced during our lifetimes. And even if society may consider what we experience as a minor trauma rather than a major trauma, it still can have lasting effects on our physical and emotional health. It may be at the root of issues with our drive, focus, moods, and even with autoimmune and other debilitating physical conditions. Today's guest is an expert in healing trauma. Dr. Keesha Ewers is board certified in functional medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, a doctor of sexology, a trauma-informed psychotherapist, and family practice advanced registered nurse practitioner with a specialty in integrative medicine. Dr. Keesha has been in the medical field for over 30 years, and after conducting the HURT study in 2013, that stands for Healing Unresolved Trauma, she developed the HURT model for understanding how past childhood trauma impacts adult health. This led to the creation of the Freedom Framework that she used to reverse her own autoimmune disease and now has used to help hundreds of her patients do the same. Dr. Keesha is a best-selling author of books such as Solving the Autoimmune Puzzle, The Woman's Guide to Reclaiming Emotional Freedom and Vibrant Health, and Your Libido Study, a workbook for women who want to find, fix, and free their sexual desire. She's also host of the Mystic Medicine Radio Show. In this episode, we discuss the process of finding and addressing trauma that's leading to symptoms and dis-ease in the body. Dr. Keesha explains how trauma is a root cause behind hormonal imbalances and autoimmune diseases, and how she guides her patients to heal these wounds for a more vibrantly healthy life. This and much more on today's episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast. I was listening to your TEDx talk earlier today, and you started off talking about how a lot of women were coming to you saying, I want to talk about biological hormones. I need hormones. And we all know that those can be beneficial in certain circumstances, but we definitely want to make sure that we're addressing trauma, because like you said, if things are just shut down and then you're trying to add, bioidentical hormones on, and you're not really addressing what's underneath it, it may not actually work for people, or they may have issues or symptoms, side effects, or things like that, right? So we've got to address it.
It's one of those places where your body will take the hormone that you're taking and take it down a different pathway than you're intending it for it to go, because of this perception that everything's not okay. And then that can actually cause some of the dangerous side effects of hormones that sometimes occur that doesn't need to happen that way, right? And so it's being in alignment, and then your body knows what to do when and if bioidentical hormones are the right answer. I mean, they're so useful. but they're just, in the TEDx talk, I talk about really you need to fix the hole in the bottom of the boat, that where those hormones leaked out from in the first place before just constantly feeding them into the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also talk a lot about autoimmune disease and your own struggles with that. And I don't know that women realize how common autoimmune disease is in women and where that kind of stems from. And I think what's interesting about autoimmune disease is that, as a naturopathic physician, I really believe, and we're taught that the body is wise and it really wants to restore harmony. It wants to restore balance. It's designed so well to help support our health. But it's really interesting with autoimmune disease when you're looking at the body actually attacking itself. And then it's like, how do we get the body in a place where it goes back to having that innate wisdom and we can really trust the body's process? But when we have these obstacles or when our immune system, where it's attacking ourselves, our body can't function the way that it's designed. So talk a bit about autoimmune disease. And I would love for you to also share your own personal struggles with that and your own awareness.
Sure. I'll start with that. And then I can go into what's happening in the body for sure. So I'm 57. And when I was in my early 30s, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. And, I was a marathon runner, a skydiver. I was raising 4 children in a family. My husband, I just was really happy in my life, but very driven, very, very driven. And drove myself to an extent that I didn't even realize that's what I was doing. I was very perfectionistic and people pleasing, I call it the 4 Ps of autoimmunity, and had a history of past trauma that I had not addressed, didn't think about it. It was compartmentalized and stuffed behind something in the closet of my brain. And so when I woke up one morning, it's much like the way my patients describe their experience, like all of a sudden I'm sick. That is indeed not what happens. It can take anywhere for, 10 to 30 years to develop a full-blown autoimmune disease. And all along the way, the body has actually been trying to warn you with little quiet noises, And so I was a chronic ibuprofen popper in my marathoning days. And so any of the little signals I was getting, I would just mask them and carry on. And so when I woke up one morning and my joints were red and inflamed, and I gained 10 pounds overnight of just puffiness over all of my joints. And it was like someone had taken the batteries out of the Energizer bunny. I was just flattened. And so I got in to see a doctor. And in the course of the history taking process, she asked me if I had a family history of autoimmunity. And when I thought about it, I thought, I think my grandfather had this. He died actually at the age I am now, and I never knew him. But he was apparently wheelchair bound with RA at the end of his life. And so she said, well, here are 2 prescriptions, one for methotrexate and one for a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Take them. And when you get worse, not if, then we'll change your medications and I'll see you then. Right. And I just remember say, wait, there's their hands on the doorknob, right? I make my own food. I'm really disciplined. Is there anything else I can do? I know the side effect profile of these drugs and I don't want to take them. And, she said, I'm sorry, you basically drew the short straw on the genetic lottery here. And, it was close the book, put it on the shelf. There's nothing more to discuss. It's genetic. And so I remember as I was driving home that my model of medicine that I'd been trained and raised in just didn't really have an answer for me. And so maybe there was something else out there. It was the first time I'd ever considered anything outside of the Western model. And I went home and I looked on PubMed where we keep our medical research, right? And discovered this article on yoga and autoimmunity. And the next day I was in my first yoga class, and the yoga teacher was wandering through the studio like they do, as you're holding a posture, and said enough about this framework of medicine that came out of India that was the sister science of yoga, which is called Ayurvedic medicine, that I was intrigued. And I went home and went to PubMed and looked that up. And what I discovered was a really interesting framework that was over 5,000 years old that didn't look at the disease process, but the person that had the imbalance. And it was just such a different way than the way Western medicine does it with reductionist science. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting way of evaluating things and seeing things. By the way, we're not all the same. So the same diet, sleep pattern, way of how much water you drink, exercise, like it all needs to be designed to fit you in the rhythm of your day, year, and cycle of life. And autoimmunity is undigested anger. And I just remember reading that and going, but I'm not an angry person. Why do I have this? And then sitting back in my chair and thinking, gosh, maybe that's a problem. Maybe the fact that I strap on running shoes and run out any frustration I have rather than actually sitting still and addressing and maybe digesting it. I never had even contemplated or heard this concept of proper digestion of emotions and feelings and experiences. And so I started learning how to meditate. And one day in the process of meditation, this word autoimmunity autoimmune was coming before my eyes. And I remember examining it for the first time really closely and saying, wow, auto means I'm attacking myself. There's nothing out here to blame, which is what I'm looking for, the answer out here. And this is me, And so I thought, I wonder if there's a time in my life when I wanted to die because I'm basically killing myself right now. And so that was a really important question for me to ask. And I went backwards in my meditation looking for that. And I found this 10-year-old little girl version of myself who was being sexually abused by the principal of the elementary school that I was attending. And I remember seeing this little 10-year-old version of me sitting, after school one day on the balcony in Key West, Florida. And like, she really wanted off the planet. My dad was out to sea. He was in the Navy. And I had tried to tell my mom, but I don't think I had the right words to say. I don't even know if I knew what the word sex was at the age of 10 in 1975. We'd lived in Japan through my childhood. I just don't even think I knew. And so I was very confused and disoriented around what was going on. And so I just remember viewing her and saying, oh, she actually did want off the planet. And so I wonder if this is connected. I wonder if my cells made an agreement at the age of 10. And here I am 20 years later, like a turkey timer just popped out and here we are. And it turns out that intuitive sense that this was connected was accurate. Science does bear this out. I've done a study about this. The Kaiser Permanente and the CDC did a huge study about this called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. But this was right? I didn't know about any of this yet. I wound up going into trauma healing therapy and able to reverse my autoimmune disease within 6 months. It was gone, and so that was remarkable because I had done the things, right? Like gotten rid of gluten, done the things that we do when it comes to autoimmunity. And yet I still was sick. And as you said, women, 80% of autoimmune diseases are diagnosed in women. And so the question comes up often, like, why? Why is that? And some of the time, sometimes studies will land on, well, we have more estrogen receptors, and then we have all this estrogen mimicking stuff out in the environment, right? This toxicity that we seem to be kind of like designed to hold on to and have it affect. And so we know that estrogen dominance is a bad guy when it comes to risk for cancer and risk for autoimmune disease, for sure. And yet there's also this other thing that when I was in my doctoral program and I was looking at PET scans of female brains, I noticed something that I had never seen in the literature before. As I'm looking at scan after scan after scan, it's well documented that we have a different brain than our male counterpart, right? Females do. And we have this thicker corpus callosum. And we also have this way that we're engineered, like in tribal days, that we can multitask, right? We can tan the hides and grind the corn and keep the babies out of the fire pit and trade the stories with each other. And while the men are hunting and gathering. Like that's kind of how the tribal format fit together. And so multitasking is, our brains are designed to do that. At the same time, we have to remember as we're out gathering herbs and food for our children and our families, where the saber-toothed tiger lives, the den, and which berries are poisonous, and the medicine stories of our culture. We have to remember that stuff. And so my theory is that also our brains are uniquely wired to hold on to the places that we've been hurt, so we remember them for the tribe. And so it was a really fascinating exploration to look at all these scans and to say, wow, the same exact architectural changes of the brain that happen when somebody's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is a shrinkage in the prefrontal cortex, your adult brain, executive function, and a growth, especially in the right side of your amygdala, when you are in a state of post-traumatic stress. Well, it turns out, as I'm looking at all these scans, those parts of the brain that are hijacked when you have PTSD, the architectural changes, the places that light up when you are in a place where you're sympathetically aroused a lot in your nervous system, are the same exact places required for a female to have sexual desire. So, I was doing a study on libido and past trauma, and I was finding this, wow. But at the same time, our immune system is also brought into that, because as long as you have this architectural change in the brain, you're also creating these perceptions that are triggering your endocrine system, your hormone relay messenger system, to tell the rest of your body you're not okay. And in that space, your immune system over time will begin to get erroneous messages. And so this is where in Ayurvedic medicine, they talk about tejas, which is fire, metabolic process, burning up ojas, which is your life force vitality. Once that's gone, you die. So the communication between those two is called prana. And when you are in a place where you're constantly stressed, and this is another study that I found, if you just consider yourself overwhelmed, you have the same brain changes, architectural changes, endocrine and immune dysfunction as somebody with PTSD. So it's not even capital T trauma, right? The domestic violence, sexual abuse, like the things that we tend to think of when we hear trauma. It's just feeling overwhelmed. Marking yourself on a perceived stress index is, kind of high on the stress scale. Like Trevor, you've gotten married, you have a new book coming out, you have all of these things happening. These are happy stressors, but on the perceived stress index, that's still high, right? And so this is so interesting. And I think that because we have this achievement-oriented, productivity-oriented society, it's like frogs in boiling water for men and women. But I do believe this is why we have such a higher incidence of autoimmune diagnosis than our male counterparts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
You just shared us so much great information. I do want to have time to shift into talking about how we address the trauma that we have, whatever it is that the trauma is, whether it's sexual trauma from childhood, current trauma, whatever it is, or perceived high stress that's ongoing. How do we address this? What do we do about this so that it doesn't negatively impact our health, our hormones, our immune system?
So every single person I think of as an individual puzzle, that there's not going to be, just like there's not a diet that's right for everybody. There's not a way of addressing your trauma that's the same for everyone. It's going to be where you are on your path, right? And what your willingness is. In my study called the Healing Unresolved Trauma Study that I did in 2013, the hurt model that came from that includes this. The first question that you ask yourself when you're thinking about maladaptive memory processing versus adaptive, where you can go back and you actually can change the architecture of your brain. You can shift, you can make that prefrontal cortex get back its volume, shift and shrink the amygdala size, come out of that hypervigilance. And a lot of what's being talked about these days is rewiring the brain. that's great. But what I see as a missing piece of that puzzle, it is the tendency to go into that downstream piece instead of what triggers me in the first place. And so the first part on that adaptive memory processing, where you're digesting your emotions, your feelings, your memories, your experiences in a healthy way, is first to ask yourself if you're willing. There's a willingness factor that has to be present. Like, I really want to shift this. I realize that some of the belief systems and the behavior patterns that have emerged from these early experiences, which may not fit the definition of trauma. So, one of the things that in the hurt model I talk about is you have this first experience when you're a child, and someone else may not think of that as traumatic, right? It could be that you were expecting, your friends to be waiting for you on the playground at recess when you're in elementary school. And then you went out, and those same friends that have been your friends for months have decided you're not their friend anymore, right? In no book is that called a trauma. But in every single person that can hear my voice right now, everyone has a resonance of that, right? Like, how heartbreaking that is when someone that you thought was part of your support system, your friendship group, a lover, right? Betrayal, rejection, all of those, they're not categorized as traumas, but they are, because we're biologically wired to know that if the tribe puts us on the outside of the firelight circle, then the saber-toothed tiger can eat us. And so the little we've got capital T and we've got little t traumas that happen throughout a lifetime. And with each one of those events that we couldn't understand, because by the time we're 26, we have an adult brain. But when we're prior to 26, we do not have a fully formed prefrontal cortex. We're operating mainly from this limbic system. And we don't know how to be humans yet. The big humans are telling us how to be human. And so they're telling us if we're doing it right or wrong, if we're good or bad. And so when we're talking about like addressing our trauma, the first step is to have that willingness to start to grow self-compassion for that little one who tripped into something that they didn't understand, didn't have a well-attuned, securely attached caregiver by their side at the moment to help them navigate it. Because we don't, right? No matter what good parents we are, our children have had those experiences too, because we don't have that person that can explain everything to us 24/7 by our side. And so then from there, if we have something we didn't understand, we couldn't navigate, but it felt traumatic to us, stressful event, then we're going to have a feeling first that happens, whether it's terror, panic, fear, anger, sadness, hurt, whatever those feeling that will happen. And then we're going to have a sympathetic nervous system arousal. We always say fight, flight, freeze, faint, but actually as children, it's always freeze. We don't have autonomy. We don't have power. We're not fighting anything, and we're definitely not fleeing. We're freezing. So we get that frozen feeling in a place in our body. And so you might start to notice that at the moment that happens, you create a meaning, because that's what we do, And so when it's with a child brain, it's going to be self-centered, because children, that's their age and stage of development. It's going to be about them. It's probably about something they think they're doing wrong. And so they're going to have that meaning, and belief goes in place. And then there's an adaptive behavior that goes right after that. So like in my case of sexual abuse, then I became a perfectionist, because the vice principal was telling me it was because I was a bad kid that this is happening. And so I said to myself, oof, if I'm going to survive, I have to actually be perfect. I did that till I was in my early 30s and was diagnosed with RA. Didn't even know, it's unconscious. So when you start looking, people will say, so to heal my trauma, do I have to know what happened? The answer is no. You just have to be willing to start engaging with your beliefs, your patterns of behavior, and looking to see if some of them are maladaptive at this point. Because what was adaptive to the child mind, the very wise mind of the child was so smart, did exactly what was necessary to survive at the time that whatever happened. But then in adulthood, post 26, you get this opportunity with your fully developed brain to go back and to say, oh, this is the strategy I created to get my needs met, but I don't have to do that anymore. I don't have to just be a people pleaser all the time. I can't live as a perfectionist. It's literally killing me. So you can't make this about willpower or a behavior change, a cognitive behavioral change. That doesn't work. What you do is you go back and you get securely attached to your own inner child, and you start to make sure that that one feels safe. And so there's the whole process, depending on where you're at on your path, that I do with people. And so it's reconciling with your own inner child, bringing self-compassion to that being that needed someone at the moment. You get to start being that someone. And so I teach people how to do that. And so again, like, don't have to have a memory of the trauma. You can reverse engineer it by, gosh, when I have a hard day, I sit down in front of the TV with Ben and Jerry's. And so then we can go from there, right? Or I'm not motivated to exercise, or I'm good. I'm on the wagon, sometimes with sugar, and then I'm off the wagon, or whatever it is. I have to have a glass of wine every night before I can calm down, or, just these different addiction to shopping, to whatever it is, work, right? Food. All of these are these adaptive behavior responses of a child mind, but they're maladaptive for the adult. And so that's what we do is start to process that in a different way.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast, be sure to share it with the women in your life and rate and review the show. And to learn all about balancing your hormones, join us for the Hormones, Health, and Harmony 9-part documentary series at hormoneseries.com.